Okay, so let's all look at this together and see whether you answer these questions correctly or not. Okay, so we have four different scenarios here. Like I mentioned, these are all events that happened in our economy. Now, when we do our analysis, we might um, simplify things a little bit, but these are all real events. Hopefully you can see how aggregate supply works. But to do this type of question, to analyze what happened to the economy when aggregate supply gets affected, remember two things, right? So basically, these are the two ways to look at your supply shocks. One is to determine if it's permanent or a temporary shock, okay? Then the second is to determine if it's a positive or negative shock. And if you can determine these two, then you can figure out the results in the economy fairly easily. Okay, so now question number one said that oil prices steadily fell in 2015. This led to a decrease in jet fuel prices for airlines. Moody's estimated that airlines spent $70 billion less on jet fuel in 2015 compared to 14, which is about a 33% drop. Okay, then the question is, how does this change in oil prices impact the aggregate supply curve? What happens to the price level and real GDP? Okay, so first of all, okay, let's draw a graph, and I told a couple of the groups in here, since you guys were working on the graphs and didn't draw a complete one, you always want to draw all three curves, since now that you have the difference between long run and short run AS, okay? And if I don't tell you so, you can always safely start at long run equilibrium unless I tell you otherwise, okay? So this is your starting point. You can call this P1, and then this is your Y star, of course, okay? So Y star is your potential GDP. P1 is where your price level is initially at equilibrium, okay? Now the question is, well, how does a decrease in oil prices impact aggregate supply, okay? So is it a short run? I mean, is it a temporary impact or permanent impact? And then whether it's a positive or negative. Okay, so what do you think? If oil prices drop like it did in 2015 or um, even recently, but recently it's more complicated, right? Because we also have the aggregate demand side changing because of the coronavirus. But in 2015, it was simpler, right? There was no pandemic going on, but oil prices dropped quite a bit. So how does that affect aggregate supply? First of all, I guess, is that positive or negative? Does it increase or decrease aggregate supply? Let's start there. Okay. Isaac says, increases. Everybody agree? Okay. Yeah, so cheaper oil increases aggregate supply because, okay, especially in this particular example, oil goes into the production of many things. So it's part of the production cost. Even if we're talking about an industry that's not an airline that uses oil products directly, all industries need to transport their products. So the transportation cost still depends heavily on oil prices. Okay. So when oil becomes cheaper, that means production costs become cheaper. Okay. So that will then increase your ability to produce. So it's a positive supply shock. Okay. Everybody with me so far? Okay. Now, the next question is, well, is this a permanent or temporary shock? What do you think?
Temporary.
It's a temporary shock because these prices on the prices on oil keep fluctuating, but just because oil becomes cheaper, it does not change the capacity for our economy to produce, right? So it might temporarily make production cheaper, but our potential to produce as a whole economy did not get changed as a result of cheaper oil. Does that make sense? Okay. So what happens here is then you have a short run aggregate supply, okay, call this 1 and 2, shift to the right, okay, and then that means your economy will go here temporarily. Okay, you go to P2 and Y2. So temporarily, the price level in your economy will drop with cheaper oil and your production will increase. But you can see that in this particular graph we drew, since we assume we started at long run equilibrium, this level of production of Y2 is unsustainable. We cannot produce here forever, right? And then in the video we talked about if we leave the economy alone when there's a gap, what's going to happen? I told you that's something I want you to write down and remember. Okay, Daisy, you said something. Can you unmute yourself and share with the whole class?
Yeah, you said that, sorry, I'm trying to find my notes. So that short run supply will always shift to correct it.
Very good. And we said if there is a gap in the economy like this, and we leave things alone, meaning we don't use policy to interfere, it is always the short run aggregate supply curve that will shift to close this gap, right? So in this particular case, okay, at this point, let's call this point A. At point A, okay, we said the economy is producing at a higher than potential level, right? Higher than normal level. And since this is for the economy, that means overall, okay, we have higher than normal production. And translated into the job market is that many industries, if not most industries, are hiring, right? Because if you're producing higher than normal levels, that means you need higher than normal amount of workers. So unemployment rate is unusually low, right? At Y2 level of real GDP, your unemployment rate is lower than the natural rate of unemployment. Okay, Josh, what's your question?
So the price level, so the y-axis just shows is it the price level?
Right,
So the price level goes down.
right, because your cost of production is cheaper, right? Cheaper oil makes it cheaper for everybody to produce.
Uh,
So yeah, as a result, your prices are generally cheaper. Okay. For airlines, if they have 33% cut in their fuel costs, then they can offer cheaper fares, right? And and that's what causes us to go from the original point to point A on the aggregate demand curve, right? Because when firms all offer cheaper products, that's when customers or all the buyers say, "Oh, I want to buy more," right? So to the supply side, this is simply a low change in the price level. So we move along the aggregate, I mean, not the supply side, sorry. To the demand side, this is simply a change in the price levels. That's why we move along the aggregate demand curve, and there's no aggregate demand shift, right? But anyway, so at Y2, we said unemployment rate is lower than the natural rate everybody's hiring, okay? So eventually workers will demand higher wages and they'll say, hey, if you don't give me a raise, I'm going to walk across the street and find a job because everybody's hiring, okay? And employers will know that's the case and they will have to agree to higher wages to keep their workers. And as they pay higher wages, that's when their cost of production starts rising, which will shift their short run aggregate supply back to the left. So this will eventually shift back, right? So the first move is to shift right, okay? And if you only analyze the first move, that's sufficient for answering this question. But I'm adding in the second part just because this is a related topic, right? So eventually, okay, it's going to move, shift backward, and you go back to the equilibrium point. Let's call this point B, right? You started at point B, went to point A, and you're going to go back to point B eventually. in this particular scenario, okay? Because point A is not sustainable. And that's and the second move here, the second shift here is how short-run aggregate supply curve shifts to close any gaps, okay? And by the way, this really does go on, right? Just earlier this year in winter semester, we were hiring for a faculty position in the department, and one of the candidates that came to interview works as an executive for a bank in Montana. And at that time in February, things were still going very well in our economy. We were very much at point A. We were producing higher than normal levels, um, and unemployment rate was way lower than the normal rate at that time. I think nationally was below 3.5%. And so this particular job candidate was teaching a class, and he was telling the students about his own bank. He was saying, man, um, we are offering higher and higher salaries. We just can't find even just freshly graduated college students to work for us. He's like, for an entry level position, I'm paying more and more, but we can't find enough kids because our competitors are offering, because nobody wants to move to Montana. So our competitor, we're offering $48,000 a year. They're offering $50,000 a year with the option of working at home from Oregon. He's like, how am I going to compete with that, right? It's like once I go back, I gotta have to jack up our starting salary again just to try to convince people to work for us in Montana, right? So that was a totally different job market just 4 months ago, but that's exactly what they're doing. And as they offer higher and higher salaries, then that was slowly shifting the economy back to the left, right? Until this whole pandemic threw everything kind of into a whirlwind. Okay, but anyway, so like I said, if you only identified part one, like the move one here of the short run aggregate supply shifting to the right, and said price level lowered and real GDP increased, you would have answered this question correctly. Okay, that would be sufficient for what I was looking for in question number one. Okay, any questions about this? Made sense? Okay, all right. So let's look at question number two. Okay, so question number two talks about what I've seen in my lifetime, and I know it sounds strange for a lot of you, but in the 1980s, okay, we had very few choices for conductive metals to work with for electronics. So that's why, you just listen to cassette tapes and watch the VHS tapes, and everything is a tape, right? So TVs, thinking back, growing up, I had an 18-inch TV, and that was awesome, right? And now thinking back, it's like, man, my laptop is bigger than that, right? So, and everything was fuzzy, and you can talk to your parents about it, and they'll tell you that you have to somehow have meat touching the receptacle of the TV to make the signal clear. I don't know why, because a lot of times the signal is fuzzy. You just stick your finger to where the wire comes in, and it'll make the picture slightly better. And so somehow, yeah, I know, sounds really weird, right? So I always joked about just buying a chunk of meat and hanging it right there and see if it worked. But anyway, so good old days, right? You guys have never lived with that kind of equipment or without internet, so count your blessings, right? So, but anyway, we said, by 2010, there were over 50 different types of conductive metals that we could use to make electronics with. And the question is, well, what has happened to aggregate supply, and how did that affect, um, price level and real GDP? So again, let's just draw a quick graph to start our question. Okay, again, unless I tell you otherwise, you can assume to start at the long run equilibrium. Okay, so again, let's call that P1 and Y star. Okay, now the question is, first of all, having more conductive metals to make electronic devices with, is that a positive or negative shock to our ability to produce?
Positive.
Positive. Now the next question is this a permanent or temporary positive change?
Be permanent.
It's permanent, right? So it's a technological change. So once we come up with a new way of making something, that technology stays with us forever, and that increases our capacity to produce forever. Okay, so in this case, it's a permanent positive supply shock, which means your long run aggregate supply shifts to the right. Okay, call this 1 and 2. So you have this shift, and we said whenever your long run shifts, your short run will follow. And the supply shock is not going to change your aggregate demand. So that means aggregate demand stays where it is, and then that means this is where your short run aggregate supply, then how it follows. Okay, so call this 1 and 2 as well. So you have this shift and the long run shift. So your long run equilibrium comes to this point where you have P2, so lower price level, and call this Y star 2 and a higher real GDP. Okay, and this one, since it's the long run shifting, you will stay at this point. There's no going back, right? And be glad you don't go back to the kind of TV I grew up with, right? And so this is what I meant when we talked about in the beginning of the class, where whenever long run shifts, short run will follow. Okay, so now, anyway, so this is a permanent increase in our capacity to produce as an economy. And this is what you've seen in real life as well. Like electronics, even though they're getting fancier and fancier over time, but the prices keep dropping. And we have more and more of them, right? In fact, you probably have seen this at your grandparents' house, VHS tape player, or called VCR. And that thing, when it first came out in the late 1970s, it cost $3,000 each. Back then, right? $3,000 in 1970s. So it's like 20 grand of today's money, right? And people still bought it. Right now, you can buy a 4K UHD Blu-ray player for like $100, right? So electronics keep getting better, but the price level keeps lowering because of this kind of increase or shift in your aggregate supply. Okay. All right. Does that make sense? Any questions on this one? We're good? Okay, now let's move on to question number 3 then. Okay, question number 3 is a sad topic, but real, right? In the Civil War, we lost 620,000 soldiers, right? Roughly the total of all the other wars we fought since then combined, including World War I and World War II. For the U.S. So it was the bloodiest war for us ever in our history, right? Now, scary to think that coronavirus has killed over 100,000. So it's all the wars, more than all the wars combined since World War II now. But anyway, the point is, okay, having that big of a casualty, okay, what does that do to our aggregate supply curve? Okay, so again, let's just draw a graph to start with, and then we'll talk about what kind of impact it has. Okay, now this one is a little bit more complicated because, okay, when you have a lot of people perish like this, it also affects the aggregate demand side. But to keep your life simple, I'm only asking you what's happening to the aggregate supply side because this is the topic of this week. So, but keep in mind that this could also affect the aggregate supply side. Okay, so all right, so we started at P1 and Y star again. So let's talk about the impact on U.S. aggregate supply. Okay, when you lose 620,000 people, okay, is that a positive or negative shock to our aggregate supply? Okay, definitely negative, right? Because well, losing people is never a good thing to any economy. Okay, now the question is that a permanent or temporary negative supply shock?
Would
What
it
do you
be
think?
permanent?
Okay, why?
Well, lives don't just replenish themselves quickly. I mean,
Okay,
you're talking at least 18 years before people are coming back to the workforce, or I guess around a decade, because children didn't go fight in the war. So you're
okay.
you're talking about a decade till people are returning to the workforce.
Okay, very good. Right, so here, this is a question where, I have usually conflicting opinions. Some say, yes, it's permanent because, what's lost is lost, but some say no because, we can have more kids and bounce back, right? Look at the baby boomers after World War II, we had tons of them, right? And so I have conflicting views on this one, but actually, this is a permanent negative shock, like Daniel pointed out, because for two reasons, right? One is, you cannot immediately replace this many potential workers right away. It takes a long time. But second of all, even if you say, hey, our population can get back to the original level, but what's going on is that these people's possible posterity also got wiped out of existence, right? So our population, even though it could grow again, would never grow at the same trajectory it would have been on if these people did not perish, right? Because especially in wars, most of these were young men that died. Usually, grandpas don't go fight in wars anymore. So most of these 620,000 soldiers did not have children or did not finish having children when they died. So that permanently shifted our population down to a lower trajectory, and when it comes to growth. So overall, okay, it is a permanent negative supply shock. So long run AS shifts to the left, and as a result, okay, short run aggregate supply follows. Okay, and then you go to P2 and Y2 star in this particular case. Now, like I said here, okay, I am assuming that aggregate demand did not shift, but in reality, of course, when you lose 620,000 people, aggregate demand is going to shift to the left as well. In that case, you can still say for sure Y2, your real GDP is going to be lower, but what happens to price level might be indeterminate, because if aggregate demand shifts to the left a lot, then you might even see a lower price level, and that's a simultaneous shift case, and that will complicate your life. That's why I'm not drawing that, but no, that's also what's going on, right? But for the purpose of this exercise, since we're focusing on aggregate supply, okay, as long as you understood that it was a permanent negative shock, again, that's sufficient. Okay, that makes sense? Questions? All right, then let's move on to number 4 then. Okay, so question number 4 is about the last recession, right? Not the one we're currently in, because we had just declared just a couple days ago that we're officially in a recession, because we have to have 2 quarters of continuous shrinking of our real GDP for us to declare that we're officially in a recession, because sometimes you just bounce down for like a month and then you bounce back. We don't count that as any recession, but now officially we're in the second quarter of economic downturn. So or sorry, and yeah, 2 months, no, sorry, not 2 quarters, 2 months of continuous economic downturn. So we're officially in a recession. Okay. Now, but this one, since we don't know how long it's going to last and how bad or how quickly we'll rebound, and so we're not going to look at this one yet. I don't have enough data. So let's look at the previous one. Okay. Now, question number 4 started by saying, okay, so part A says, assume we're in long run equilibrium and graphically draw it. Hopefully, if you listen to my suggestion of drawing your graphs along the way, you've drawn this several times, right? So long run equilibrium, we said, happens when all 3 of the curves on your graph cross at the same point. Okay, so this is our long run equilibrium of, again, P1 and Y star. Okay, so that's what part A looks like. Okay, now if all 3 curves do not cross at the same point, then you're not at long run equilibrium, but you still can be at short run equilibrium, which is where aggregate demand and short run AS cross each other. Okay, and in that case, you would have a gap in your economy, and that needs, that will close whether you interfere with using a policy or just leave things alone. Either way, okay, that gap is going to close. Okay, but they close differently, right? But anyway, so we'll talk about that in this question. Okay, now part B says, okay, during the housing crash of 2008, many U.S. consumers saw dramatic losses in their stock portfolios, leading to a decrease in their net wealth. In the same time, business investment also fell substantially. Which factors of GDP are impacted by the housing crash? Display this impact on your graph. Okay, so when I ask you which factors of GDP are impacted, I'm talking about, GDP equals C plus I plus G plus net exports, right? So out of those 4 factors, 4 components, which ones were impacted based on the information I gave you? Okay, so,
C and I.
okay,
What's
C and
it?
I,
C and
is that,
I.
okay, very good, right? Faith, that's exactly right, okay, because consumption decreased because consumers saw a lower net wealth, right? When their wealth went down, consumption lowered, okay? And then investment, here we mentioned that investment also lowered dramatically as well. A lot of businesses pulled the plug on any future development plan they had at the time. So C and I both dropped. Okay. Now, how would you display that on this graph here? So, what do lower consumption and investment impact on your graph? Is it supply side or demand side? What do you think?
Is it both?
Okay. Faith said it's
No,
both.
I'm asking. I'm not
Okay, all
saying.
right. Okay. Faith is asking whether it's both. What do you think?
I'm sure it's demand, but I don't know if supply as well. Maybe both.
Okay. All right. Okay. Anybody else want to offer their thought? No thoughts? Okay. All right. So it's definitely aggregate demand. Okay. Now, aggregate supply in this case actually does not get directly impacted. Now, down the road, right, when you lower your investment, then eventually your short run and long run aggregate supply may not grow as much as they could have been, right? Because here we're assuming long run aggregate supply doesn't change, but in reality, with investment, long run aggregate supply over time slowly shifts to the right. That's how our economy grows, right? But when you have lower investment, then eventually, years down the road, it may not grow as fast or grow as much. But as of the immediate effect, supply side is not impacted because consumption and investment both are spendings, and spendings are the demand side. Because remember we said, C, I, G, and net exports are all the different sources of spendings in our economy, right? So when C and I, when you have a decrease in C and a decrease in I, then that shifts your aggregate demand to the left because now consumers and firms are spending less in the economy. So that leads you to a short run equilibrium right here. You go to P2 and Y2, and Y2 doesn't have a star because it's not at the long run equilibrium level. Okay, so that means now you have a gap, a recessionary gap, okay, this size. So this is your recessionary gap or the size of your recession, okay? So that's part B. Any questions on that? Why we shifted aggregate demand and why there's a gap now? Okay, now part C says what type of gap has been created as a result of this, and this is a recessionary gap or a contractionary gap. Both mean the same thing, okay? And then it says what has happened to potential GDP, actual GDP, and the price level as a result, okay? So price level decreased. Okay, now actual GDP is where you are right now at your short run equilibrium. So actual GDP is Y2. That clearly also decreased. But what about your potential GDP? Did it decrease as well?
It didn't change.
It didn't change. Okay, very good. So Y star is still your potential GDP. Okay, because even though we're not producing there, okay, but the potential for our economy to produce is still at Y star, right? So it's kind of like sometimes I look at this and say, hey, how can I ever throw any gospel perspective into economics? Here's my 2 cents, right? So this is Y star is your potential of returning to Heavenly Father as a son or daughter of him, right? Your full potential is to become just like him, to become like a god or a goddess. And now Y2 is when you sin and mess up, right? So just because now you're falling short does not change the fact that you have potential to be just like our Father in heaven, right? So if you repent, then you bounce back, okay? All right. Now I feel pretty good for inserting that into the lecture. Okay. All right. Does that make sense though? Why potential doesn't change? Okay. Good. All right. Now, the question, next question is, if we had left the economy alone, how would it have closed this gap? Meaning that we did not leave things alone. Okay. We actually interfered with lots of policies, which we'll talk about plenty in the next several weeks. But if we had this gap and we didn't interfere with policy, okay, what would have happened? Okay, which curve always shifts to close a gap when we don't use policy?
The
The
short
supply.
run.
Okay, the short run aggregate supply, very good. So because if we don't use any policy, what would have happened was that, remember at Y2, we said we're in a recession. So unemployment rate is higher than the natural rate, right? In fact, back then, nationwide, we went up to 10% plus unemployment rate. In certain states, it was, if you recall that video we watched, in California, it was like 22% at certain areas. So if we had left things alone, eventually people would have accepted lower wages, right? And they would say, man, things are so tough, I can work for less. And in fact, many people did do that. I have some neighbors across the street from me. They built a house back in 2009, so after the crash had happened, and they said, man, they had contractors that would just drive by seeing them building a house and then just leaving them a card and begging them to give them some work and say, hey, I can, I can lay tile, I can do a stucco, or I can, put your roof on. Please, just I work for cheap. Just give me something. And well, then they built another house across the street from me in 2018, 10 exactly, or 2019. Sorry, yeah, 2019, 18 to 19. So exactly 10 years later. This time they had a completely different experience, right? Because everything was, first of all, way more expensive. And also this time they were the ones begging contractors to come and work on their house, and nobody had time. They had to wait for weeks and weeks before anybody would come and work on anything. So that's the difference between, a recession versus a booming economy, right? So back in 2008, okay, if we had left things alone, people eventually would have all accepted lower wages, and that would have lowered the cost of production, which would have allowed short-run agri-supply to shift to the right, and eventually we would have closed the gap like this. Okay, and then we would have gone to this point where price level would have decreased even further, but would go back to Y star, our potential GDP, and close that gap. Okay, so that's what happened. That's what would have happened if we had left things alone. Now, in reality, okay, what we did was that we did not leave things alone, right? And okay, if I can get it just right. Okay, we did not leave things alone, and we used policy. And I briefly mentioned this in the video, and we'll talk plenty more about this going forward, is that when you use policy, you cannot force producers to change their production by holding a gun to their head and say you have to hire more workers and produce more, right? But what you can do as a government is that you can say, hey, how about we buy some of your products, right? You offer to buy, you offer a higher aggregate demand to stimulate more production. So using policy, what we did was the government spending went up, and we had tax cuts so that people would have more income, and then people can afford to consume more. So we shifted aggregate demand back. Now it took years to shift it fully back, but that's what our attempt was, right? So we went from this point back to the original point where price level rose back, and then real GDP went back to the potential level this way. So this is what actually happened, right? We shifted aggregate demand back toward AD1 level to close that gap, and that's what policies do, right? Because policies, like I said, you cannot just force production to happen, but you can certainly induce production by offering to buy more products. Okay, so that's the difference. All right, any questions? Does that all make sense? And Faith, do you feel better about those shifts in long run, short run?
I do.
Okay, good. All right. All right. Well, in that case, that's all I prepared for today. And hopefully this will help you to continue to study and understand the material better. Now, test 2, just a little heads up. Test 2 is the most difficult test in this whole semester. Is quite a bit harder than test 1 because of all the in-depth content we've covered and all the formulas and calculations and etc. So make sure you study and put in more effort into it. And I know you guys generally did quite well on test 1, but don't let that kind of fool you into thinking you don't have to work as hard on test 2. Okay. Now, I forgot to mention that I do have a extra credit activity I want you to do. Okay. Normally, what I do is I have a game that I play to illustrate some points in class to teach you how to study more effectively. But it's impossible for me to do that virtually, unfortunately. So what I'm going to do is I'll just post the information in Canvas, and so what I'll do is I'll post the link to a few short videos about how to study more effectively in college. And you watch those videos and then answer some questions, write up a couple paragraphs to answer some questions, and then post that in Canvas, and I'll give you 1% of your total grade as extra credit. Right? So 1% of your total grade translates to 100% on a quiz or concept check quiz. So you know, if you have one that you don't like, then this is your chance to replace that, or just you know, even if you don't have any quiz you want to replace, do this anyway, because at the end that 1% could make a difference, right? If you're at 89, this will bump you to 90. Okay. So anyway, I'll post the information about that on Canvas. Look for that, and then I usually give you a week to do that, and then you can write that up. If you have questions, you can email me and I'll explain. Okay, but hopefully the instructions I give you will be pretty clear. Okay. All right. Well, any questions from you guys about anything?
Brother Ma, what
Yeah.
date does the second test open?
It opens on the 22nd, so Monday, almost 2 weeks from now.
Okay, cool.
Yep. Okay. If not, then I guess I'll see you guys next week. Have a good rest of your week.
Brother Ma,
Yeah.
question. So you know how we did the last exam and you gave us those extra points, or
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
so on my like grade sheet, it's showing that my total grade is 104.52. Is that, why is that? Are you gonna adjust that that like test so that I get 100, or are you gonna keep it so
Oh.
that it's above 100?